remain somewhat dispersed virtually. Those of us who gather here in the auditorium gather in Lenapehoking, the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape peoples. So I therefore begin by reminding us all that Columbia University, like New York City and indeed the United States, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of numerous indigenous peoples, to which I add that tonight, directly or indirectly, we will no doubt be reminded of other no less brutal exclusions and erasures, and perhaps called to do more than merely acknowledge them. In this, the first lecture of the fall series here at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. So my name is Reinhold Martin, and among other things, I'm privileged to direct the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture here at Columbia, of which this evening's speaker, Charles L. Davis II from the University of Buffalo, is a most valued board member with whom we at the Buell Center have had the honor to collaborate for some years now. As a member of the Architectural History and Theory faculty here at GSAPP, I've also had the special pleasure of sharing Charles's writings with incoming Master of Architecture students in our introductory history survey, where students grapple with difficult social, cultural, and indeed moral questions of the sort that Charles has done so much to illuminate in his uniquely generous, capacious way, reawakening classic subjects and introducing new voices in a manner that challenges students and scholars alike. Charles L. Davis II is an associate professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Buffalo. His groundbreaking book, of which he will speak this evening, Building Character, The Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style, from the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2019, has received the College Art Association's 2021 Charles Rufus Morey Book Award. As the CAA announcement puts it, Building Character, quote, presents an eye-opening overlay of the racialized body to the often told historical account of the rise of modern American architecture. The work is a reflection, continuing with the CAA announcement, the work is a reflection on racial justice in the United States and the colonial and racialized legacies of our institutions of learning and art and architectural practice. To which I want to just add that what may seem like a layer, a sort of supplement of race added to stories told for generations about so-called American architecture, has the effect in Charles's work of revising those stories so completely, turning concepts like character and style so thoroughly on their collective heads as to render them virtually unrecognizable to the faint of heart, who may find themselves constitutionally unprepared for such a drastically subtle education, or, as someone once said, enlightenment. Charles received his PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and has a MArch and BPS from the University of Buffalo. His academic research excavates the role of racial identity and race thinking in architectural history and contemporary design culture. His current book project, of which I think I've also caught some glimpses, and which is tentatively titled Black by Design, an Interdisciplinary History of Making in Modern America, recovers the overlooked contributions of Black artists and architects in shaping the built environment from the Harlem Renaissance to Black Lives Matter. Charles has published widely on these and related themes in articles and essays in Architectural Research Quarterly, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Harvard Design Magazine, Log, Aggregate, Appendix, and VIA. Equally important, you will know Charles is a co-editor of Diversity in Design, Understanding Hidden Consequences, 2015, and I have to say with GSAPP PhD alumna Irene Cheng and our own Mabel Wilson, a co-editor of the rapidly sold out Race in Modern Architecture of 2020 on University of Pittsburgh Press. And his research has been supported by numerous institutions, including the Canadian Centre for Architecture and the Grand Foundation, among others. So finally, in addition to his service on the advisory board here at the Buell Center, Charles, who is also on the editorial board of the Aggregate Architectural History Collective, currently serves in an important role on the board of directors for the Society of Architectural Historians, where he's co-chair of its Race and Architectural History affiliate group, and producer and co-host with Maura Lucking of its podcast, Race and, or Race ampersand, which I wholeheartedly recommend, especially for its multi-part series on America, quote, America as a settler colonial project, which of course brings us back to where we began, to the modest inadequacy of our land acknowledgement. So it's with this finally, that sense of inadequacy, of not yet rising to the challenges of the historical occasion, but also in the reassuring knowledge that we have with us this evening a colleague with whom to join in solidarity as we attempt collectively to do just that, to meet the moment, that I'm pleased and honored to give you Charles L. Davis II. Charles.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that very generous introduction, Reinhold. I'd like to thank Reinhold for introducing me and for Columbia for inviting me here to speak. I'd like to spend a little bit of time here just giving you a bit of an overview of the book project and to talk a little bit about sort of what its outgrowths are as I'm moving forward into other book projects and other areas of study. So let me share my screen here just so that we're all on the same page. So as Reinhold mentioned, this book is entitled Building Character, the Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style. Here's just a sense of what the table of contents looks like as you look through the first 2 chapters of part 1, the second 2 chapters of part 2, and the conclusion. But if I were to give you a brief summary of what this book is about, and also sort of what the critical stakes are of this project. This book is an intellectual history, revisionist intellectual history of the ways that white nativist thinking has grown in North America in the transatlantic exchange of ideas about architectural style in the 19th century. So the book takes us from Western Europe, primarily in France and Germany, although there are some references to Ruskin's work in London and other theorists, and then looks at the ways that ideas about race and architectural form come together and migrate across the Atlantic to then take on new life in the United States. And it's important to remember that a subtext of this book is thinking about the United States not through the lens of its purported claims of being a liberal democracy or a place of freedom, kind of perfecting the vision of the founders as we move towards a more perfect and polyglot nation, but actually understanding the consequences of it being a settler colonial society, as well as it being a pro-slavery democracy. And what this means for both non-white peoples in the United States and how they are reflected or not reflected in the national building cultures of the United States, but also in a way of turning back time and understanding the context of the 19th century, really coming to grips with the complexities with which people in the United States debated the constituency of whiteness and the way that whiteness has become a ubiquitous factor of architectural theory of that time period. And so the book takes us through the notion of Aryan character and Alpine architectures in the late 19th century, and shows how it produces what I call the whiteness of American architecture in the search for American architectural forms through figures like Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and then the afterlives of this in the international style debates. So in order to understand the ways that I've tried to limn the racial charge of architectural theory, it's important to think about the ways that so-called architectural characters in the literatures of the 19th century, in the works of French architect Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, German architect Gottfried Semper, American architect Louis Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright, and then William Lescaz, parallel and mirrors the notion of racial characters of national groups. And so character becomes this cipher through which I try and interpret the racial charge of the work. And I'm really interested in the ways that architectural character and the discussions around architectural character seem to peak during periods of dramatic national change and heightened nativist sentiment, both in Western Europe and the United States. So we'll look at things like these two images here, an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson about character, and particularly about Anglo-American character, and the ways that character in the United States was prefaced by Anglo-Saxon character overseas, and the ways that he understands it evolving as it crosses the Atlantic and literally moves west and advances Western civilization in this migration of ideas and of peoples. And Louis Sullivan's character studies, which you can find in the Sullivania archive at the Art Institute. And this particular study was done in December of 1874, where he compares the vernacular character of country housing with the social typologies, or the types of characters that are emerging within the city nearby, from the old gossip that you see on the very far left to the sort of degenerate socialites and aristocrats that we see at the top right. And so I'm really interested here in the ways that physiognomy, as both a literal, at least at the time, scientifically understood phenomena, and a metaphorical trait of forms, be they architectural forms or people themselves, starts to create a link between the transcendentalist philosophies of people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, the architectural theories of people like Louis Sullivan, as well as contemporary theories in biology, racial anthropology, and the ways that these things map onto one another if we use the terms character and physiognomy to see how this occurs. And I'm particularly, at least for this particular volume, focused on the idea of architectural organicism, the paradigm of architectural organicism, as a philosophy of making that looks to nature to understand how to create architectural forms. And it is within this naturalist paradigm of architectural invention that we see that physical appearances are believed to be regulated by invisible forces. And at least in the literatures of biology and racial anthropology, and in the architectural theories that I'll show you here today, the ideas surrounding the empirical categories of race and style are thought to subtend underneath both of them in a way that one mirrors the other. And particularly in anthropological literatures, as we'll see, scientists would use illustrations of material culture and style to signify a racial group. And these figures one of the other, whether it's a racial profile or a stylistic entity, would be used as proxies for one another. And so this ability to substitute one for the other, for me, became a clue as to how race and style not only paralleled one another, but intersected and overlapped one another within architectural discourse. Here are some examples of what that would mean, particularly in the use of type categories in the late 19th century. If we look from left to right, we can see some of the typological categories for plants created by Carl von Linnaeus for botany. We can see some of the translations of this thinking, type thinking and categorical thinking, in ethnology in the second image, where we're looking at the pairings of different types of peoples in different cultures all around the world, associated with the material cultures that would become representative of what scientists believe were the essence of their characters. And it's interesting for me to note that in addition to both clothing and what we're to assume is also one's manner of speaking, the culinary elements of one's culture, we also see in the landscape and in the architecture in this diagram associations between a people and a racial group and the kind of either vernacular or national building styles that are associated with them. And so architecture has consistently, even within scientific literature, been associated with this idea of typological categorization that would lead to race thinking in the 19th century. And then finally, on the far right, there's an image of vernacular architecture drawn by Viollet-le-Duc himself, for his treatises on the habitations of man in all ages, as he believed architectural forms evolved from the most quote unquote primitive forms into the most complex forms. And here we're looking at what he believed were the early primitive huts of the Dacius, or early Asian peoples on the west side of the globe. Excuse me, on the east side of the globe. Here's another diagram that we can look at, this time coming from the United States, in Knott, Glidden, and Morey's Indigenous Races of the Earth. And as you can see here, there's still this kind of regionalist thinking associated with race and race identity. But in contrast to what we might popularly understand racial differences to be today, as social constructions of difference generally associated with skin color, which we see adhered to at the very top of this diagram, there's also the sense that race conditioned the human body underneath. And it was the structure of the skeleton, the bones, that were the true source of racial difference. And we see this in the second row, just beneath the designation of the different races of man at the top. And if we read this diagram vertically, we can see that the different regional variations of racial difference in man are also associated with regional differences in the animal kingdom. And this is a polygenetic chart. So there's this belief that these different racial groups might also designate different species of man, which would then mean that the characteristic differences between racial forms of intelligence and temperament were set by nature, and would therefore result in a kind of hierarchy of intellect and a hierarchy of civilizations. So not just geographical variation, but also racial hierarchy was what was implicit in some of these ideals. And so in the book, I really pursue a line of reasoning that traces the transformation of architectural theory in the late 18th, early 19th century, as Vitruvianism is starting to decline. And we see after many challenges, particularly in this particular narrative from the French École des Beaux-Arts and the rise of the French academies and the infusion of scientific logic, particularly logic from the natural sciences, to rationally structure and restructure architectural thinking. I'm interested in the ways that Vitruvian anthropomorphic metaphors give way to other conceptions of the body, both in the natural sciences, but also in the form of corporeal metaphors in architecture. Continual references to bodies or bodily functions, the notion of the building itself as a kind of body with a kind of skeleton or bone structure on the interior, which is supportive of an exterior form that becomes representative of the structures inside it itself. There are German, French, and English terms that emulate these notions. And all of them, at least the ones that I compare in the book, are associated with a kind of naturalism that drives an instinctive process of form making, which in nature is thought to be run by physiological and autonomous operations. But in architecture, as the architect emulates nature, this time in the 19th century, not literally imitating the forms, but trying to imitate the processes that nature uses to create elements, you find that architectural theorists start to talk about nature as if it stylized the different empirical appearances found within it. And therefore, they could emulate that structure to stylize architectural forms to mirror the racial characters of those found within the national groups themselves. So in this shift, I'm really thinking about the ways that a divine-oriented or divine-centered notion of the human body in the Vitruvian man, in the form of different forms of the column orders and their supposed origins, give way to a more scientifically rationalist interpretation of the built environment. And as we look at man, not as necessarily driven and ordered and perfectly guaranteed by a divine source, but understanding that man within nature has different temperaments, different skill sets, different intellectual prowesses, and that these would then influence, in congress with whatever raw materials are available within the environment, the different forms of architecture that are available to them and that they could make. And at the same time, as we can see on the right side with Claude Perrault and his scientific investigations and reformulations of the column orders, thinking of them in scientific terms, thinking of them in terms of the species of columns, according to the methods of the ancients, we can see how this notion of the body now starts to move towards an empirical understanding. And so for me, the conceptual parallels between the natural sciences and the scientific rationalization of architectural theory result in a set of design strategies that abstract the principles of nature in ways that personify the behavior of buildings. We start now to think about and to talk about buildings and the process of design, not as something that is necessarily driven by the will of a designer or an architect, but as if the building is a living entity all on its own. And here's a set of diagrams that you might have found at the École Polytechnique in France, showing the different ways that site conditions combined with various programmatic requirements naturally start to morph the types of planimetric diagrams that are appropriate for a particular site condition. And it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination to start to understand some of these plan diagrams in series, as if they would morph from one condition to the next and to the next, depending on exterior environments, almost as if the stimulus of the outside site conditions were influencing the formulation of these particular architectural forms. You also get discussions about architecture where the scientific language of categorizing found species or found specimens in nature by typology start to reemerge. And this is very clear in some of the language in the École Polytechnique around programs and the way that programs would be represented to the designer to learn how to program these different types of buildings at the same scale, but across different civilizations, across different courses in time, as if they were found etymological specimens outside in the world, pinned up on the wall. And so both in its analytical and generative language, we see an emulation of the scientific processes and scientific thinking. And so for me, at least in terms of trying to structure a revisionist intellectual history of organicism from Western Europe to the United States, I'm really interested in the implicit human body metaphors that were embedded within these corporeal notions of architectural form, and trying to identify them as they emerge from certain nation states at critical points in time as they're starting to nationalize in the 19th century and early 20th century. So as I mentioned before in part one, I look at the Aryan character of Alpine architecture, and at least the scientific literatures that are most seminal in this section are the Aryan migration theories of both linguistics and ethnography, showing the reconstruction of so-called sister languages and mother tongues on one level, and of literal anthropological racial types as they migrate across the world in another. And the ways that the scientific conception of early European migrants, particularly Aryan men, Aryan migrants, in the Alps as a kind of skeletal frame that connects the now different nations of Europe, how these architectures suggest a kind of pure form in the primitive pasts of these cultures, and how architects like Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc and Gottfried Semper revived these pure forms or primitive forms in the present to denote both the historical origins of their contemporary nation states, but also to revive some of what they believed were the most admirable qualities of these Aryan men in the present moment, in what they thought was the perfect vision of French modernity or German modernity. Chapter one looks at the ways that Viollet-le-Duc does this with his ethnography, domestic ethnography of the chalet form, translating it into a kind of concrete modern idiom here, as we see on the right side, in his own house studio in Lausanne, Switzerland, Villa La Vedette. Chapter 2 looks at the ways that Gottfried Semper, in his desire to create an ethnography of architectural history, to divine the historical origins of the German nation state, particularly as they're trying to come upon a solution for the problem of German unification with the Prussian North, the Austro-Hungarian South, with multiple languages, multiple religious customs, and multiple material cultures competing for dominance within this kind of political framework. So how does one unify a nation and move them towards modernization when there are so many cultural bases at work? And in this chapter, I explore the ways that Semper's research presented an alternative where one could literally design their way out of the problem by returning to ethnographical history, understanding the origins of all of these different complex differences within the German modern nation state, and reviving an image of their unified past to bring them to a unified present. And so I'm really interested in the ways that his theory of tectonics and architecture allows and affords for this kind of experimentation. In part 2, I then analyze the way that these ideas specifically from Viollet-le-Duc's structural rationalism and Gottfried Semper's tectonics moves to America to afford a particular form of Anglo-American interpretation of American architecture. And I'm looking at the ways that explicitly white definitions of national character influenced the identification of what we now know of, or what we now label as American architecture. So this would, of course, entail looking at the implications, both socially, politically, and culturally, of ideas like manifest destiny, like ideas such as terra nullius, and the idea that land owned and occupied by Native American groups was somehow empty and free to be claimed and conquered and turned into private property, as well as the ways that African slaves, Chinese laborers and coolie laborers, Native groups from Canada moving into the United States are all marginalized in terms of who is best suited to move America as a new nation into the future and to contribute to the shape of their arts and letters. Chapter 3 looks at the ways that Lewis Sullivan, as an Irish American himself, attempts to write himself into the history of American arts and letters, as well as to translate scientific notions of physiognomy into his own architectural practice, as he's creating the form of American character through his so-called democratic architectures. And then chapter 4 looks at the ways that this transatlantic migration of ideas about organic form and architectural character now start to slightly shift in their visual representation in the international style, as we're moving consciously away from styles of architecture that visually represent national differences into styles of architecture that are supposedly international and thus can migrate to any part of the globe and situate themselves regardless of national context. I'm very interested in the ways that international style theorists and architects within this kind of self-proclaimed formal definition of international style architectures nationalize this particular kind of discourse. And in this case, I'm interested in the ways that William Lescaz Americanizes international style idioms to create public housings in the United States. And because of the racial stratification of US public housing policy, he is doing so, or Americanizing the international style, for an explicitly white working class audience, some of whom are immigrating directly from Europe into the United States in the successive waves of immigration at this time. And by doing so, he's allowing for the pan-European pedigree of the international style, as it was introduced at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932, to afford a positive transition of ethnic identity from the white immigrants who are moving into the US into the white middle class of the United States, to literally become American and become assimilated. And the ways that both socialist theorists and progressive theorists at the time are using public housing, and particularly the art and the forms of mural painting within public housing, to discipline the subjects within the working class subjects to become good middle class citizens. And the whiteness of this discourse at both the social and political level, but also at the architectural level. So I'm just going to take you through two of the chapters just to give you a sense of how I lay out these arguments very quickly, and then leave some time for us to discuss what I believe are some of the contemporary implications of this work in both architectural historiography, but also in terms of architectural design and some of the ways that we can ask questions about what kinds of values we are continuing to perpetuate by not asking some of the questions about race and identity that I ask in this volume of the architectural canon that we use on a daily basis there. So if we look at chapter 1 and revisit Viollet-le-Duc's work and his modernization of the Aryan Hut, it's important to realize that he's one of the first architectural theorists to combine architectural history, ethnography, and illustration in a way that creates a visual narrative of the past, one that was clear and almost didactic for his architectural readers. And in doing so, he creates an ethnographic history of the vernacular typologies and the transformation of those typologies into modernist typologies for both the histories of France, the histories of Russia, and some of the so-called non-Western cultures, what they would refer to as Hindu cultures and other Proto-Aryan cultures of the past. And the book that I focus on in his writing and rhetoric is both his dictionary of French architecture, as well as the history of human habitations. And what's interesting about the history of human habitations is that in this book, it really clearly diagrams the parallels that Viollet-le-Duc sees between physiognomic characters in the races and the physiognomy of architectural forms, and how both evolve and change over time. And what's interesting is that if you look at the first 6 chapters of his book, you'll see him visually representing the different races of man, but in his representations of them, he's trying to communicate to us where he believes they fit on the hierarchy of racial intelligence. So those that are more advanced tend to look from the left to the right. Those that are backward or governed by an authoritarian culture or by a more primitive temperament are looking from the right to the left. And some of those who fit in between, as we can see the Chinese figure at the very top in the middle, these figures are sort of stuck in the middle. So that they're pausing in between, either looking to the left or looking to the right. And the visual illustrations themselves were meant to communicate this hierarchy of forms in a way that would lend a clarity of interpretation to what was valuable and malleable, at least in the present moment, about their architectural forms. And so here are 2 illustrations from the first 3 chapters of the volume, looking at the physiognomy of the Aryan Hut as he believed that it emerged at the height of the Aryan mountain ranges as it was evolving over time. And he talks about it as if it were an original log cabin set up and abutted against a rock face. But over time, as they learned more about the climate and the harsh storms and the moving of tectonic plates within the mountain itself, they moved from a wood physiognomy to a stone or masonry physiognomy in order to be more in keeping with their original context. And if we follow this story, not just within the Aryan form of evolution itself on the bottom row here, but if we compare that with the way that the Dacians, as he depicts them, evolved from the primitive hut as a kind of exterior wooden structure to a kind of log cabin itself, then he dramatizes the moment when these two cultures meet, and inter-ethnic conquest results in a kind of marriage of these forms. And just like in biology, there's a kind of sexual union between these two typologies that produces a hybrid architectural form, which is the form you see on the right side. And so between the Asian cultures at the top and the white cultures on the bottom, we get this architectural form that combines the sort of visual or elevational characteristics. But what's even more interesting is that when you look at the floor plan of this building, it anticipates the floor plan of Roman villas in the future. And so he's trying to create a kind of historical planimetric origin point for some of the ways, the origins of both Greco-Roman and Roman cultures as they move into the future. And it's important to note how his experimentation and his speculation on the ways that both racial physiognomies and characters and architectural characters is found and amplified in his study of the sciences. And so here are two images of his study of the Alps in France, which he was commissioned by the government to do. And he conducted both mapping surveys over the course of 8 to 10 years, but also he did these beautiful representations of the mountain range itself. The bottom image is the contemporary state of the mountain, and the top image is Viollet-le-Duc's reconstruction of what he believes its original state was in the antique past. And he would develop a kind of geometrical theory of the ways that the tectonic plates themselves moved and shifted as a result of the very harsh weather that occurred at the very top of these mountains. Now, we can see a real parallel between the way that he tells the story of the Aryans and Aryan evolution in his own architectural writings, and the ways that he's literally scientifically investigating them in the geological structure of the mountain itself. We also see this parallel in the ways that certain typologies would evolve regionally in his work. If we compare his own design for Villa La Vedette with some of the drawings that he did of Swiss chalets in the countryside that were reconstituting what they looked like during the nomadic roamings of Frankish tribes that existed in and along the French-Swiss border before either nations became separate itself. And so when he builds Villa La Vedette in Switzerland, he's actually trying to refer back to a French-Swiss lineage of Aryan migrations and Aryan architectural and material cultures that he wants to revive for the present, that at least for him allows him to show how he used science to present himself and perfect himself as a modern subject. Here's the interior of that building, Villa La Vedette. And what I think is interesting here is that in the very articulation of the interior, both in terms of the mural that he painted about 2 years after he completed the building, but also in the architectural articulations of this space, we get a reinstantiation of the primitive state of Aryan man in this location. This is the salon on the first floor where he would entertain guests, where he would meet clients, and where he did much of his cartography for the Alpine mountain range itself. And what's interesting is that when you look at it straight on, and you look at the different elements of it, you can see that some of the pilasters and pier elements on the interior emulate the tent poles that Aryan men were supposed to have used as they settled in the plains below after migrating from the mountaintops of the Caucasus Mountains into the surrounding territories. And the ways that his architectural space, all the way down to the fireplace itself, rehearses this idea of the Aryan man sitting in the open plain and really understanding the landscape, and in his mind also thinking about where he's going to go to conquest and to conquer and to spread his own culture in the world itself. This is a kind of visual geography. And at the bottom, you see the mountain range that's sort of dramatized and reconstituted here. What's really interesting about this building is that if you go back to this image here and you see the very far window on the left side, outside of his window, if you stand on the site of where this building originally stood, which I actually did and took a photograph of, you'll notice that he's looking across Lake Geneva at the Alps, and he's looking at the present state of the Alpine mountains themselves. So between this mural, which is a reconstitution of that mountain range, and the mountain range as it exists, Viollet-le-Duc is sitting literally sandwiched in between both of these things, using scientific knowledge to both update his architectural vocabulary, but also to think about the ways that he can think of himself as being part of a continuous lineage of Aryan migration in France at that time. If we then shift gears and move to North America in the work of Louis Sullivan and the ways that some of the ethnographical assumptions about evolution, teleological forms of development, and racial character find their way across the Atlantic through translations and English language translations and the way that this form is adapted in the US, we can look at the work of Louis Sullivan to really understand how this would translate itself in the US context. I'm going to focus particularly on the building on the right, which is the synagogue that Louis Sullivan designed with Denkmar Adler, his partner, in the south side of Chicago. And this was a Reformed Jewish synagogue. And his architectural forms, particularly this base form, tried to divine what a secular architectural form would look like as Reformed Judaism transformed in what Sullivan believed to be a kind of more secular and civic form of congregationalism for previously religious subjects who were moving towards the ideal, the Enlightenment ideal of sort of secularization in the US context. And it's important to note that within this congregation, there were two distinct phases of occupation that are important to understanding its meaning. The first was the original Jewish congregation that Adler and Sullivan designed this space for. And the second was its reoccupation by a Black Baptist church in the 1930s that eventually led to this becoming Pilgrim Baptist Church, and which was one of the birthplaces of gospel music, and particularly the gospel blues in Chicago. And so for these two congregations, this space serves as a key setting for their Americanization. But what's interesting is that within Sullivan's own writings, only Jewish Americans had a place because they were an extension of the white ethnic subjects that he believed were best suited to lead American arts and letters in the world and to create a new form for American architecture. He was very skeptical of the assimilable characteristics of white ethnics who were born overseas and were first-generation immigrants in the US, because he believed that their associations and their hearts still lied with their original nations. And he was doubly skeptical of the assimilable potential of non-white Americans, African Americans, the Chinese migrants, and all the other types that we talked about earlier, particularly because of the way that he adhered to this ethnographical literature in architecture. So if we really want to understand Sullivan's notion of character, both where he gets it from and also how he reinterprets it in his own architectural idiom, then we need to look at least two sources. One is his love of literature. The other is his love of caricature and physiognomic representation as he learned it overseas when he visited the École des Beaux-Arts. So if we start with literature, we go back to people like Emerson and also Walt Whitman. Whitman was someone that he personally wrote letters to and tried to communicate the fact that he was trying to create a physical form of poetry that would emulate Whitman's own lyrical form of poetry, but for an American context. And both of these authors were very heavily invested in this notion of an Anglo-American character, what its historical origins were, and what it meant in this new context. both in kind of just purely racial and ethnographical terms, but also in political terms, in terms of what kind of nation, democratic nation, would emerge and appear in the US, and what types of subjects were most suited to advance this notion of character. If we look at Emerson's book, English Traits, this is his most extensive theorization of the ways that Anglo-Saxon identity, as it had invigorated the British peoples in centuries past, was now moving across the Atlantic westward to advance Western civilization in what he believed was the Middle West of the United States, to produce Anglo-American character. And the virility of that old culture is now moving west to the United States. This perspective made him very popular both in the United States, but also in England, where he would go visit some of the philosophers and literary critics of the day to think about and think through what this would mean both poetically and in practical terms in the US context. And Whitman himself would also imbibe on this thinking. And many theorists on Whitman sort of point to the ways that he refers to non-white peoples, and particularly Black slaves, after the Civil War and during US sectionalism, to talk about the ways that he looked upon them favorably. But if you look at both his private writings and the way that he engaged Black identity in the press, you understand that this flourish was a kind of rhetorical flourish about the ways that white Americans, in particular Anglo-Americans, were thinking about freedom as being a universal principle. But in practical reality, just like Sullivan would eventually become, he was skeptical of the integration and the equality of whites and Blacks. And here's a quote from an op-ed that he wrote in 1858 in the Brooklyn Daily Times. He said, "Who believes that the whites and the Blacks can never amalgamate in America, or who wishes it to happen? Nature has set an impassable seal against it. Besides, is not America for the whites? And is it not better so? As long as the Blacks remain here, how can they become anything like an independent and heroic race? There is no chance for it." And so given this, then, for me, it colors the way that Louis Sullivan is starting to translate and to think about character. There's a kind of racial charge or racial tinge to what this means, not just in terms of the so-called quote unquote natural ways that regional geographies and vernacular architectures produce typological forms and social organizations, but the ways that then this lends itself to a kind of hierarchy about who is central to the American experiment and who is peripheral, who is going to be guiding this element. So if we look at the way that physiognomy appears in Sullivan's writings, it interestingly appears both in reference to human beings and physical forms, as well as inorganic elements like architectural forms, mountain ranges, and other elements that fit within nature. So there's a spectrum of this natural law that undergirds or underpins all formal expressions of character in the world. And so in his book, Kindergarten Chats, we can see him talk about the ways that the character of a pier or a column would reflect the character of a race itself. And he believed that this was an automatic process that happened as an architect designed structures. But we also see him looking at and analyzing the literal physiognomy of people, from his own father and mother to his business partner, Denkmar Adler. I'll just read a couple of quotes here. It says, "It seems strange at first glance that these highly virile and sensitive powers should be embodied in one so unlovely person. His medium size, his two sloping shoulders, his excessively Irish face, his small repulsive eyes, the eyes of a pig of nondescript color and no flash, sunk into his head under rough brows." This description is of his own father. So here's an image of Sullivan's father. And in my reading, Sullivan is really trying to distance himself from what he sees as the low potential of someone like his father, who in fact was an entrepreneur who had made a good living in the United States and by all means was successful. But in terms of leading the charge towards innovative forms, he sided more with his mother, who was of French German descent. And so trying to distance himself from the pejorative ways in which Irish Americans were considered, all the way to anglicizing his own name, O'Sullivan, to writing himself as different from his father, instead having the creative potentials of his mother. So when you read his autobiography of an idea, he really celebrates his mother's creativity. He says that he gets his love of drawing and of nature from her. And he describes lovingly her features, her eyelids, the shape of her face in physiognomic terms. And what's interesting is that when you look in his library, he owns manuals of physiognomy that actually emulate and provide for him a criteria for emulating the description of his mother. In his volume, it says, as to the mother, Adrian Liz Sullivan, she seemed French, but was not wholly so. She had the typical eyelids, expressive hazel eyes, an oval face, features mobile. She was of medium stature, trimly built, highly emotional, and given to ecstatic ecstasies of speech. And in this physiognomic manual in his library, you can read a description of someone like her in the monogamic eye. Wide awake, eager, active, very susceptible to surrounding impressions, readily observant. Such eyes generally have much feminine expression in them. And he talks about the ways that this expression would lead to a kind of cupidity of thought that he found in his and reference in his own works. He even describes Denkmar Adler, his partner, in these physiognomic terms. Further away stood Adler at the draftsman table, full frontal view, well lighted. He was a heavy set, short-nosed Jew, well bearded, with a magnificent domed forehead, which stopped suddenly at a solid mass of black hair. He was a picture of sturdy strength, physical and mental. We can find again the typical Jewish nose, both in the ways that it satirized supposed Jewish greed and wealth acquisition, as well as notions of their intelligence itself. And so I argue that these various notions of physiognomy and character, from transcendentalist literatures, from physiognomic manuals, from his love and imitation of caricature at the École des Beaux-Arts, evolves into a form of architectural physiognomy that Sullivan uses to express certain social and political ideals. Here is his original design for the Reformed Jewish synagogue on the left side. It combines two elements, current elements of the 19th century. One is a kind of ethnographical record of older synagogues built within Western Europe during times of great persecution against the Jews. And during these time periods, what you'd have is a kind of more sedate monolithic form, the Orientalist elements that were popular in some of Denkmar Adler's father's congregations and some of the older Jewish congregations in Chicago had disappeared for a more tempered and restrained approach. And this combined with the architectures of H.H. Richardson, who had revived some of the Romanesque features of the past, but particularly in his urban sites, he was interested in a kind of a very taut and very clean architectural style that would become picturesque at the upper levels, but really keep to the street and the lot line at the bottom parts, as a formal expression for the straightforwardness and utilitarianness of civic architecture. So in this bottom image, we're looking at one of his courthouses associated with a prison. And so the secular character of these two elements, Sullivan wanted to bring together in what would be essentially an ecclesiastical structure, which here takes on a kind of fort-like character in the ways that he originally wanted to design it. If you look at the plan, just to give you a sense of how these spaces are generally organized, there's a first floor where you enter off of the street level. That leads itself to a series of social clubs and public rooms. And then up the stairs, sort of elevated from the profane level of the street to the sacred, we get then the interior auditorium for the congregation itself. And it's within this space that we see Sullivan really attempting to unify with his botanical ornament and the arrangement of the space, the ways that this divine space seems to bring together all the elements of nature in a kind of organic whole. And at least for my purposes, what's interesting here are the ways that he's treated the back wall of the auditorium as a kind of front wall for the space. This is very different than the ways that Orthodox synagogues are arranged. They have a kind of a lectern or bima in the middle of the space. This one orients it back against the wall, emulating Protestant religious spaces, as well as the fact that the foil at the back of the wall, especially at the top portion under the arch, this was covering over the organ that was built into the wall itself. And so as the congregation would and the chorus would play and sing into the space, if we look at the very left image, the two alcoves on either side of the lectern would be where the chorus members would stand, and the wall itself would seem to emanate the word of God and the sounds of nature into the space, as if the building was organically connected to these natural principles that were governing its own structure. But this is the building that he actually ended up designing. And the way that it is typically discussed is through the idea of cost and budget, that somehow the congregation didn't have the amount of money to deliver his original design, which most critics believe is much more organically synthetic than this particular design, instead of some other issue. But what's interesting is that when you look at both within the newspaper and the local press, and also in the ways that Jewish congregants talked about themselves, in the ways that they wrote their own histories, not just the leadership, but also the congregation members, what was really contentious, and also not just in general, in the ways that synagogues were represented in a kind of orientalized form in some cases, but particularly their criticism of architects like Sullivan, is that the ecclesiastical function of the building was not very clear and readable from the outside. So we can imagine sort of Sullivan's vision here. It's kind of fort-like secular mass for the civic realm. Here, what we have is a bit more sturdy element at the bottom that retains some of those elements, but then something a bit lighter at the top in the clear story level. What's interesting is that Joseph Siri was one of the first people to look at the windows at the top and to think of them as emulations of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, sort of addressed across that space. For me, what was interesting is the ways that it was described in the Jewish literatures about the congregation, and the ways that it emulated descriptions of the Ark of the Covenant, and the ways that the religious symbolism there was mapped onto the space. But for whatever reason, this design has shifted and changed. For me, it's an important visualization of the ways that Sullivan's vision gave way to what I am describing as a hyphenated architectural form, one that shows a kind of tension between the Reformed Jewish congregation's desire to be accepted within secular white America, but also to retain hints of their own religious past and the singularity of that within history itself. And as this building moves over to other social groups in the South Side, particularly as it starts to become a segregated enclave and African Americans move in, the visual expression of this building starts to have different registers for this group. The first was as a kind of normal institute in the vein of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. And this should make us think about Booker T. Washington's lectures at Tuskegee that were collected in the book Character Building, which discuss the ways that utilitarian-looking buildings, not of any particular style, but more for the solidity and the fixed and permanent character that they had, was suggestive of the contributions that Black Americans were yet to make to America in civilizational terms. This experiment of turning this into a normal institute had started and fundraising began, but it fell through. And as a result, instead of it becoming a Washington Institute, it was sold to the Pilgrim Baptist Church and became the center for a Baptist church. I talk a little bit in this chapter about the ways that the religious symbolism within changes, both the moving of the organ itself from the inside of the wall to the outside of the wall, adding to a greater level of integration of Sullivan's organicism, but also the ways that the congregation itself and the space along the stage starts to spill into the audience that's there. And for me, this is really telling about the breaking of that wall. You no longer have the alcoves containing the chorus and the arch containing the organ, but now those elements are spread into the space itself, which was one of the spatial innovations of Black religiosity, particularly as it was moving from the old time South into the new time North, changing the oral character of the music, changing the sense of fellowship within the congregation itself. And the religious figure, the preacher, moved from being a distant person that everybody saw to one who almost touched the crowd, with a large retinue of chorus members and deacons following him to show the sense of fellowship that was emerging. And so for me, the notion of Southern hospitality, Southern religiosity, and Southern musicality starts to radically transform the interior, to revise some of the interior elements. We only get certain surface or superficial clues in the architectural ornamentation, but spatially, we start to see a deconstruction of the organic whole that Sullivan was trying to hold together with his architectural frame. And what I think is interesting is that on the outside, as they were renovating this building and keeping it up, they allowed for the ornamental elements on the clear story level to fall away. It was not as expressive of their religiosity as other elements, but the interior, and particularly the auditorium, they maintained as well. Unfortunately, and very recently, the building underwent a fire as they were renovating the building. And so the only thing that remains now are the outside walls. And I believe that the attempt to restore this building has now become defunct. But when they were engaged in fundraising, they were working with historic preservationists to determine which period of the building should they restore it to. Should it be the original design by Adler and Sullivan in the 1890s? Or would it be that moment when gospel music came into the church itself? And they sort of went back and forth on this issue for a while before deciding that it probably would be best to restore it to the state when gospel music emerged in the building because of who was occupying the building itself. And so in the architectural restoration, even, we have the clear story level being held in abeyance as they're restoring the building and having this debate about what state of the building it should be restored to. For me, this is a key moment because it's conceptually a question between should architectural historians value the state of the building's origin, the ideas and thinking of the architect himself, or the long history of the building, which in this case, with the inclusion of African Americans, actually makes it a democratic architecture. It actually expands beyond the white ethnics that Sullivan was interested in building American character to becoming a kind of pluralistic, multivocal kind of space. And so it's only by including the long history of this building that we get to understand Sullivan's architecture as attaining its goal. And only when this building, by accident, through racial segregation, is stewarded by a Black congregation, do we see this fulfillment come into being. And so for me, this calls into question some of the both foundational disciplinary definitions of architecture, of form, of style that we inherit, that when we examine historically, we find them to be racially exclusive, but also the very definition of architecture and what we should value within the building itself. Should it be the formal concepts that the designer has, or should it be the complex ways that it engages with its site and with its space? And if so, then what definition of architect can we inaugurate that is different from the exclusive artist architect that we've inherited from the École des Beaux-Arts and other sources into the present. And so now this literature is sort of leading me to really reinvestigate the notion of American architecture as a settler colonial kind of inheritance, as well as that's an extension of my critique of whiteness in the discipline itself as it currently is constituted, but also an excavation of the forms of Blackness and alternative modernisms that have emerged from African American communities and other communities of color that we've omitted or overlooked because they don't quite fit the origin notion of the intention of the designer in a case like this one. Okay, thank you very much for your patience and for sticking with me as I made it through the presentation. I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you have.
While we invite Reinhold to the front, I'll say to both the audience in the auditorium as well as the audience online that we will be taking questions in the Q&A in the webinar, which I will read aloud to Reinhold and Charles as they speak. And also in the auditorium, we will pass the microphone if anyone has a question. But first, Reinhold, if you have something that you'd like to enter in the dialogue before we, as the questions emerge.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Charles immensely for, again, an incredible lesson in, among many other things, like sort of how to look at a building. I really didn't mention also in introducing Charles how rare this skill is, and we just saw it kind of demonstrated. Amongst architectural historians of, basically looking at a building and decoding it in the way that you just did. So for that, I'm grateful. I have a couple of sort of broader questions that touch a little bit on how, methodologically, on how, we are to conceive the particulars of your work. And maybe this goes a little bit to your future work as well. In its own terms, which, as you said at the beginning and a couple of times throughout, as a form of intellectual history. So it's really, you didn't really say architectural history, although obviously that's how we can and should understand this work. But you really did foreground, let's say, architectural history, I would say, as something like intellectual history or contribution to intellectual history. And so I kind of wanted to try to explore that a little bit with you, and maybe then, as we're doing that, some of our colleagues will also have some thoughts. I really just have kind of two questions that both of them in many ways pivot around what we could describe in the 19th century on either side of the Atlantic as a tension or sort of, even interplay between Romanticism and rationalism, now structured in terms of the relation between what we could or has been called the racial science, the pseudoscience of race that you described, and what we might call, again, with certain obvious qualifications, something like poetics of race. In other words, the construction of social meaning and cultural meaning in relation to, and maybe even out of some of these other discourses. So I just was wondering where we could go with the sort of back and forth. Some of this is a little bit factual too, about, that maybe you could elaborate on in terms of your actual the kind of historical research on which these arguments that you've just explained to us, again, very elegantly, are based. So, for example, on the racial science side, more or less from Blumenbach to Cuvier, which is to say from a monogenetic, quote unquote, degeneration theory of race to a polygenetic theory of racial hierarchy in Cuvier, probably the latter more influential in architecture culture in the early 19th century, functionalist paradigm. We have this sort of racial science exhibited on display. And you said, like in this kind of, your very nice kind of account of this, that the transition from the Vitruvian paradigm of the orders to the orders as kind of architectural species or something, like analogous to the description of biological beings. I wonder whether factually you're able to document or recognize in some textual form or whatever transactions moving in the other direction that are meaningful to us in the conversations we're having here as scholars of architecture, in which certain ideas, and for example, like those being elaborated at the École Polytechnique, might have made their way back into natural history, as it was called at the time, or what we would call the natural sciences. It seems to me this does happen later in the 20th century with the later organicisms, beginning basically with Darcy Thompson, and then some of the other British organicists. But I don't know. What do you think? I mean, it seems the reason I'm asking that, Charles, is as you're as you're thinking about this, is one of the challenges that you present us with as an intellectual historian is how to position architecture amongst the human sciences. Right. And it's difficult because architecture is institutionalized very differently. This is not taking place in a royal society or in a university, but in these kind of polytechnics and academies, through which virtually all of your figures are moving, and very few of them have a formal scholarly education. So, yeah.
I think that's a really interesting question and line of reasoning. I mean, I will say that methodologically, at the very opening, I was very interested in transgressing a disciplinary history, and really suggesting a cultural history. And so by doing so, I think I wanted to open up architectural thinking to other realms of thought. But in the 18th and 19th century, I mean, I'm finding in the two kinds of modes you're talking about, the scientific and the poetic, there's a kind of, at least at the time, they're believing a factuality to the procedures by which physiology and physiognomy operate. But in terms of character, there's an admission that it's almost an art form. It's a form of judgment based on one's understanding of the world. And that because of that, I see a kind of back and forth between the facts at hand and the criteria within either the natural world or an architecture that allows one to make judgments about when a character is authentic and when it is not. And it's that authenticity that I think lends itself to the kind of back and forth between these two literatures. The place where I saw the back and forth happen the most was not within biology, but within racial anthropology. When they're talking about and using material culture as a kind of proxy for architectural or for racial character. And I see this, the back and forth really happens a lot in the Semper chapter, where he's not only looking at them and trying to consolidate all of the different findings of ethnography, but by the end of his career, he's almost looked at as kind of like somebody who is an anthropologist, like somebody who knows it just as well as scientists do. And so there are lots of people referring to his work in the ways that you might refer to a natural scientist or someone in the field. And I find there's some of that happening a little bit as well with Viollet-le-Duc's work, but there's still an indexicality there where one can sort of, in the work, they could see these are the words of Cuvier, these are the words of Linnaeus, these are the words of others, whether it's Gobineau or whomever it is that he's citing, that refer back. But Semper's work seems to be very synthetic. And there's a kind of respect for that I think lends itself back into that literature. But beyond that, I think your question for me is really interesting in the American context, in the US context, when you have a much younger scientific audience, and the ways that they gain political purchase is through the ways that their work has impact on the broader public. And I know that Joanna Merwood's done some really good research on the ways that ethnographical ideas find itself into architectural trade journals like the Inland Architect and some other spaces, particularly when they're talking about what is the potential of American architecture in the Midwest. And I see a lot of parallels there, but I have to go back to see whether the scientists are actually reading the architects and what the relationships are between that. But I think that's a really interesting way of trying to think about the project and the lineages of
Yeah. Well, yeah,
cooperation.
it kind of, interdiscursively, basically, amongst in an environment where there may be specific occasions for these discourses to encounter one another, but they are to some extent operating institutionally in different spaces. So, okay, so and the other reason I didn't say immediately, though I probably you recognize it, for asking that is there's one way in which architecture as culture, could be written off as, all of this basically, start to finish, would be basically written off as ideology. It's just like, basically this is sort of, okay, sort of a overdetermined, sort of appropriation or misappropriate, as is often said about so-called social Darwinism with respect to Darwin, and even Spencer. So methodologically, you're not taking us down that route. You're not simply saying that what we're presented with here is a parade of ideologists, of misguided, something else is happening. So maybe I'll give you a chance to characterize that for a second, and then I have my one more question about poetics.
So in those terms, and it was really important for me to think about race, both in terms of the ways we tend to talk about it today as ideology, and to do a critique of ideology, but also to think about the very procedural lessons that architects learned by studying the concept of race. And for me, what was really interesting, especially in figures like Viollet-le-Duc and Gottfried Semper, are the rules of design that they learn by studying the race concept. So even at a formal level, they understand that interior processes guide and regulate external forms, that external forms and their physiognomic representation to the world must refer to these interior conditions. And organicism, architectural organicism, is sort of premised on this kind of integration, synthetic integration of space, structure, and form. And because those things go back and forth, if we only read the iconology of the outside as ideology, then we miss the structural elements and constituents and the spatial constituents. And so I thought that this realm or paradigm of architecture was so interesting because of the integration of that. And it was because of that integration that I feel I'm able to trace into even the international style, the racialization of forms, without a kind of ideological premise that relates directly to nationality. Because you can read it in the structure, and you can read it in the spaces, and the ways that these international style spaces discipline their subjects in different contexts, sometimes expressed on the outside, like with the brick finishes of Lescaze's work in public housing, but not always. Sometimes it's just through the trace of the structure and the ethnographical or historical origin of those spaces, or the spaces themselves. And so for me, race was a bodily concept, like a fully bodily concept. And because it was so corporeal, it was the perfect metaphorical basis to reinterpret how the body, the architectural character, could be reconstituted in an empirical world and in a natural science world for the communities that they served. And I'll just say that what really convinced me to pursue this topic during my PhD years was being at Penn and listening to the biological analogies that people were making about nature does this, and here's biomimicry, and here's biomorphism. And I just felt like I was reading treatises from the 19th century. And I was like, why do we continually make this parallel? Why do we rely upon this? And so I wanted to really know the appeal for architects for this kind of structural understanding of what I find to be a kind of racial argument about the body, and to sort of warn people about its extremes, the way that this can easily lead to an essentialist understanding of the world, and reinforce the kind of hierarchies between the global South and global North that we see today.
Yeah, well, no, I hear you there for sure. So a quick question on the other side, and then we'll gather some audience questions. The other side, meaning the side of poetics, but specifically a poetics of the individual in relationship to the poetics of population, or this kind of science of populations that became so-called racial science or biopolitics in the later 19th century. And I'm thinking of Emerson. Emerson, you know, I know you know, also wrote a series of essays on what he called representative men. So figures from Plato to, I think, Goethe, who were singular in their contribution to, you know, all white men, of course, but to his canon. And so in that regard, you have, it seems to me, a sort of tension, and this is maybe on the romanticism side of the romanticism rationalism sort of equation, in which, you know, the same figure, Emerson, is drawn to describing and exemplifying in his own being, of course, as well, the poetics of the exceptional life. The life, you know, the individual, and of course, this belongs also in the kind of catalog of American myths, which we could also probably in your kind of economy of the artwork and discourse that you're demonstrating for us, assimilate also to the singular artwork, the poem or the work of architecture that cannot be typified or reproduced in that kind of more mechanical way that, you know, some of these other discourses presuppose. So I don't know, what do you think about the poetics of the individual?
So I think that's an interesting tension. It's one that actually Sullivan addresses explicitly in his work. He says that, you know, one can think of the exceptional genius of the architect, but that for one, in racial terms, exceptional genius is only possible in certain strains of racial identity and ethnic identity. So certain peoples are more predisposed to make that than others. And it was literally upon this logic that he argues for his own inclusion as an Irish American, as an exceptional person. I'm not really Irish. I'm an American. I'm a mongrel. I'm somebody who has absorbed all the genius of the best parts of America and proves that as an experiment, it's possible. But then, because, for me at least, because this notion of individualism is just the peak of what he's looking at as the fixed temperaments of the collectives, and the notions of the fears of miscegenation and the need for segregation that is implicit within that within this notion of individual genius, it's really a typification of what the best of the best can offer within these communal groups. And I find that, as you say, there is this kind of romantic view of the individual that tries to read them as different, as separate and distinct. The rugged individual is the one who really makes himself, and everyone is equal within the American context. But there's a repetition of this idea of both the rugged individual, who typifies an American mode of thinking in the later chapters, and the ways that both William Lescaz and Wallace K. Harrison come to represent the businessman architect, and the ways that they are able to manage the complexities of the sort of European cultural distinctions in buildings like public housing and the PSFS tower for Lescaz, but in the United Nations for Harrison, working with folks like Le Corbusier and others who were singular geniuses in their own right. But there was something quintessentially American about his ability to synthesize all the lessons that they had into something that was singular and representative of the world, but American in its sort of thrift in the ways that it represented the essential values that we could date back to the Anglo-Saxon, the Protestant notions of American citizenship there. So I try to read within them the ways that these individuals are calved from these collectives, and the way that then the collective myths underneath them are racialized, but then covered over by the kind of focus on the individual in that kind of telling.
Yeah, that's a great, Howard Rourke and John Galt, two sides of the American racial imaginary. So, well, okay, so we have maybe some questions. I don't know, I defer to Lila. Yes. Benedict. Oh, we have to learn how to do this again. This
I know.
Q&A in person. Hey, Benedict.
Hi. Thank you so much for the lecture. Oh, there I am on the screen. Hello. Yeah, I guess I wanted to, if this is not too annoying, to return to your what you said about the formation of this research at Penn in that moment of your graduate studies, because what that raised for me was a question of like, to what extent do you see the persistence of structuring effects of this historical complex that you describe in the book of a moment in which the explicit invocation of theories of racial types was undergirding the kind of metaphor between architecture and ethnographic studies and ideas of the formation of a kind of racialized organism. And I guess my question is really just, to what extent do you see, given that by the time you were a student at Penn, the explicit references to racial types had been more or less expurgated from organicist theory in architecture. Yet one would imagine that given the kind of historical co-constitution of theories of architectural form with these kind of racial theories that you're describing in the book, that even in the absence of an explicit reference to racial theories, there could be a kind of implicit, persistent structuring effects of racial ideas or notions of racial types in later organicist discourses in architecture. And I wonder if you can just kind of speculate on that and what it means also for even contemporary analogies between architecture and organic form.
So for me, your question really, it makes me think at two different levels about this question. One is sort of historiographical in the ways that the modern architects that I'm tracing in the volume, where they get their references back to science. And so I find that like in the 19th century, it's explicitly biology and certain elements of racial anthropology, really ethnography and ethnology. In the 20th century, we start to see more sociological references, criminal anthropological references that are much more outward looking from the individual to the collective, and making certain broader assumptions about what are the essential elements of these cultural collectives. And so within sociology, you get a kind of racialist way of thinking, but not always immediately being referenced back to race types, race categories, etc. Although the implications are that there are civilizational, national implications in terms of hierarchies that are established there. So at least for me in this project, I find that where the architects start looking and the language by which they borrow from the sciences dictates how explicitly we see race being referred there. And for me, this parallels the broader conversation within the humanities about the ways that, particularly in the United States context, the explicit references to race, racial identity, racial communities starts to shift. It starts to become much less explicit, much more implicit. And the ways that we map these characteristics onto people is with coded language. The codes have shifted over time, but I find the logic to be quite persistent. But then, your question also makes me think about, and there was this moment during my PhD studies when I was asking other PhD students, sort of, what are you learning in your first foundation courses to the field? Like, who are the figures that you're learning, and what do you learn about these figures? And what I found really curious was that every PhD student knew that there was racialist language in Viollet-le-Duc's work and in Gottfried Semper's work. But nowhere in a survey of architecture did this fact appear, and nowhere was this expanded upon in a kind of book-length monograph. And so there were ways that people recognized that this was a part of the foundational text to modern architecture and architectural as a discipline, architecture as a discipline, but it was never expounded upon because of perhaps what it might mean for diminishing the prestige of these individuals, or the prestige of the foundation of the field, or what it might mean in terms of understanding how these values are embedded within our current discourses. And so for me, this was almost like a kind of purging, like those first two chapters were purging of that moment and just telling the world that, yes, we know it's there. Let's have a broader conversation about it. But then the second half of the book was really a way of finding what links connected those ideas to a kind of transatlantic dissemination within the American context. And for me, there's something interesting about the American context, both in the early 20th century, for the ways that it adapted those very ideas to a kind of manifest destiny kind of context. But also even today, where we think about the United States as being the center of knowledge production. But we think about the United States not in terms of colonial identifications. We don't identify the United States as a settler colony. We usually tend to think of it as kind of liberal democracy, some place where race and racism is a kind of exceptional aspect of life here, as opposed to a core element of how it is structured. And so in both the early 20th century moment and in the present moment, I see a kind of surreptitious, tacit understanding of how race operates, but an argument about why it should be viewed exceptionally. But this is not constitutive of the field itself. And so that's been what's been gravitating me back towards these moments to kind of stitch them together to understand how it really subtends the way that we think. And the fact that whiteness in our society today has become invisible. We don't see it, we don't talk about it. For me, is a clue that it is really constitutive of the ways that we see. It is central to how we see it because we see it as normal. We see it as standard instead of seeing it as just one category of many. And so it took me a long time to kind of see that relationship. But for me, it was really, like, what are these guys learning? What are we learning? And why don't we ever write about what it is that we know is there in a kind of explicit way to have a shared conversation?
So there are several comments here, mostly of gratitude for Charles. So I'll just give a general thank you so much. And also, no, we're not going to change the camera to me when I do the thing. Two questions, and I suspect the latter will take us to closing. So I'll read that one second. From Bruce Rosen. What does the restoration of Notre Dame adhering to Viollet-le-Duc's interventions say of his ties of Gabonneau, ironically, the foot of the island anchored by a Holocaust memorial? And from our colleague, Lucia Allais, thank you so much. And can you tell us more about your current project?
Mm-hmm. So the first question, I think, is really beautifully answered in Michael Camille's book. On the relationship between Viollet-le-Duc and his sort of creative restorations of the past, really trying to find a way of visualizing what he thought of as either the representative types, the pure types of the Gothic cathedral that never really existed in history, but were somehow more expressive of what that essence would be. And so there are certain historical references that he makes to the different types of statuary and other forms of ornament that are there. But Camille does a really good analysis of the ways that certain racial stereotypes circulating in France also find their way in some of the grotesque figures that are ornamented on the church. And so some of the ways that Jewish nomads and travelers and gypsies are represented start to find themselves in the grotesque natures of some of the figures on the church. And I cannot remember the name of his book, but it is about Notre Dame specifically. And there's a chapter in that book specifically about the way that race and race thinking, both locally in France and then sort of more globally across Western Europe, is contributing to some of the racial stereotypes that one finds in Viollet-le-Duc's work. And if we think about what that might mean then for, I think you're asking about like sort of the restoration of Notre Dame after the tragic fire that was there and the different responses to it. I don't know how to answer it besides putting it in this way, that when I first heard the news of what was happening, and then the excitement for some people to say maybe we can just redesign it, like let's have a contemporary top on it. But really, at the end of the day, this notion that Notre Dame represents the essence of France in some way, that it must be restored, faithfully restored. And that this viewpoint was even buffered by some prominent American historians who have a relationship with France. And I won't name names, but the sense that this is somehow so fundamental to how the French identify themselves and who they are as a nation, that it must be restored, faithfully. Given the kind of liberal freedoms that Viollet-le-Duc took in incorporating some of both the stereotypes and the type forms that never existed into that space, I found it both like appropriate, but in an ironic way that I don't think people really understood. That there's something about the kinds of racial ideas about who is French and who is not that is embedded in that building that we could analyze and reassess in the ways I'm trying to assess in this volume, that would tell us a lot about who is making those statements, and whether everyone in France would agree in terms of whether Notre Dame really represents this kind of essence of who France represents and who is essential to the character of that nation. And in terms of Lucia's question, I'll say this, that in the next project, so in my mind, like both this volume, Race and Modern Architecture, and some of the works I've been doing that try to reassess the settler colonial ideologies that subtend American architecture. For me, all of that is of a piece because it critiques the whiteness of our field and tries to make it visible and tries to make it a subject that we can absolutely study and discuss together. The next project for me is a recuperation of Blackness in the field. And for me, this is slightly a departure from the disciplinary critique, because I find, at least in the African-American works that I've been looking at, a vision of architecture that exceeds that of the monument maker, exceeds that of the artist architect, and really blends the long history in the United States of the master builder, particularly in years when it was illegal for an African-American to become an architect, into the years when they become licensed architects and emulate the norms of modernist discourses and others that are the normative standards of the day. But there are elements of how they look at precedents and embed that within their own works, and also what they think of architecture as being, particularly in relationship to space and space making, not just form making, that I think is really interesting. So in the work that I'm looking at now, I'm trying to both move beyond the kind of, I don't know how to put this in a way that's clear, but there's a kind of like Black boosterism around certain figures like Paul Revere Williams, Robert Robinson Taylor, Vertner Tandy, Francis Abel, like this notion that, we can do it too. We're just as good as white folks, and we can become architects. And, all you need to do is look at the historical record to see that we can create buildings just as rich and just as interesting as those, the dominant figure. But then when I look at their works, particularly like if we look at the work of Paul Revere Williams, who's mostly known as like an architect to the stars, somebody who was a kind of encyclopedist in terms of architectural styles. If we really deconstruct the ways that his work works both within the United States and then within the Americas more broadly, and the ways that he creates and curates certain styles for certain clients, some of whom are non-white clients, and what that means, it's more than just him showing that he can master those styles. There's a complex way in which he's interpreting what the cultural associations are with those styles and how his mastery of it or his subversion of it talks to his own identity as a Black American in one context, but just as an American in another context, and the ways that he's trying to subvert the expectations, particularly in his use of Spanish colonial architectural forms and styles, and the plasticity with which that style has meaning at a particular time. And so I'm really looking to kind of bring some depth and complexity to the ways that we understand African-American architecture. not just as one that emulates the kind of hegemonic Anglo-American form in this country, but one that contributes a completely different way of seeing the landscape and the built environment. And perhaps even then suggesting an alternative definition to what the architect might be. Not in the mode of the École des Beaux-Arts coming into the United States, but a different modality that is both sui generis because of the conditions of being broken away from their African heritage, but also global in a way that I think we don't quite recognize in the ways that we analyze African-American architecture. So I say that as kind of like a tease to get you interested in the project and what's happening, without necessarily like having to go into case studies and expanding upon what that looks like. But Paul Ray Williams would be one characterization. We can also look at some contemporary projects through the lens of Black Lives Matter and other Black social movements to get a sense of the broader work that these projects are doing, not just within architectural discourse, but in terms of those communities and how they understand the builders and the makers of their spaces to be operating.
All right, well, that is an excellent promissory note on which to end. And I so once again thank Charles for his generosity intellectually and institutionally in sharing across these screens and these spaces your thought and your project really with us here this evening. So it's a wonderful way to begin the semester, this rather singular semester that we're all in. And so we invite everybody to also do what we do on screen and in person and say thank you to Charles Davis.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Let me just wave.
Thank you, Charles. Oops. My bad.